Kia ora, and I guess good evening. My name's Sarah. I'm currently based in Paris, although I'm from New Zealand. I have an interest in the right to housing. It's what I focused on when I did my master's here, and I'm now working for a global human rights NGO, and excited to be with you both this morning.
What is a constitution?
What is a constitution?
What is a constitution? A constitution is, I think, a kind of societal backbone that we collectively agree to live by, or don't collectively agree to live by, depending on how well it's done.
I would define a constitution, as a set of principles that a society has agreed to live by, and ideally enables us to live together. And I
always think of the constitution as rules and regulations that white people steal from Indigenous folk and then refuse to apply in their relationships with those said folk.
Are constitutions useful?
My Irish father used to say you only need the rules when things go wrong, and I think that's true. Like most of the time people just get on doing what they do. You pull something like a constitution out when you're having a huge debate like the Mantiki Mind debate about whether we've actually gone down massive wrong alleys.
Nice.
Can you describe New Zealand's constitution?
I feel that requires an understanding of, geography, which has never been my strong suit, but we would not be able to see it in any case because New Zealand doesn't have one.
We keep saying we're going to get one though, don't we? And we keep thinking we'll overthrow the Queen and we'll overthrow the treaty and we'll move on to a higher standard, as if we've somehow reached and exceeded the standards that we've set for ourselves.
But when you look at what we do have, like a Bill of Rights or a Human Rights Act, I mean, they're a bit narrow and constrained too. So the bits we do have are a bit minimalist. Yeah.
When you're in the state sector, Sarah, how did people talk about constitutions?
To be honest, we didn't.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because my best friend here is from the States, and it's just she can't fathom the fact that a country doesn't have a constitution.
In our country without a constitution, what's happening with the human right to housing in Aotearoa?
New Zealand is bound to ensure the right to housing because it's ratified the International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So it is bound to ensure the right to housing for everyone, but it hasn't incorporated that covenant into domestic law yet, despite the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights recommending that it do so, I think, at least twice now.
How does a government get away with entering into international agreements and not delivering them on the ground?
Well, that's the eternal question, or one of them, isn't it? And because there's no real enforcement mechanism internationally. I mean, states can be kind of called out at the time for the universal periodic review, but I mean, if it doesn't implement the recommendations following that, then nothing really happens. I guess shame on the international world stage, but I mean, that can only go so far, not very far at all, it would seem. So,
how many of the elements of the right to housing can you name?
So there's availability. There's Housing doesn't follow AAAQ. But there is availability, and then there's adequacy. Basically, it's got to kind of shelter you from the elements. It's got to be near schools. Got to be near facilities. It's got to be affordable, and quality is included in the subset of adequacy. And it's got to be culturally. Can't remember the specific wording that they actually use for that. Actually, whether they say it's culturally adequate or culturally acceptable.
Fiona and Moira, pop quiz. Can you name the rest of the elements of the right to housing?
There are more?
No,
Again,
but there are lots of other things. Is that a good answer? I think.
Not really.
No, I can't answer all of the other bits.
because I actually think if you go a step above the right to housing, you get into that space where people should be able to have the beauty that enables them to be and do the people they are culturally. So that might include a choice of building material, locally sourced. It might include being able to be on your land, on your whenua, being surrounded by people in your community that you want to be with, important for people at any age, but especially for older people aging in place. It might be having your GPS set appropriately. One of the kuia I interviewed, she looked out her front deck and saw, her two her islands, her maunga, her marae was at her back. It's what my colleague Kirimato Piper calls her cultural positioning system.
Is part of the sense that the human rights framework is a bit of a wet bus ticket, because we assume that progress will be achieved through legislative pathways. And so I guess I wonder whether that's a not very helpful reliance, and comes from the fact that people who frame human rights are typically lawyers. So for them, they're like the hammer where every answer is a nail. And if we focus more on communities enacting their human rights in a more community-led way, in a more disruptive way, we might come at different solutions.
How can there possibly be skepticism about human rights? Is that like saying we are skeptical of voting, or skeptical about protecting privacy?
A key reason, or the key reason for skepticism regarding human rights, is they have traditionally been seen as this very individualistic, state-focused model where it's the domain of lawyers and, I guess, old white people, maybe old white men. But I think human rights can be more transformative than that. And I think if we push them, they can really be a way, a kind of framework for how we can live together and how communities can live together, how things should be governed, how to govern their own resources, how to deliver their own resources. I think you always have to have the state there, because the state is the one with the legal obligation. But I think that doesn't necessarily just mean that if something goes wrong, you make a legal claim to the state. I think that the state can play a really enabling function that's based on giving full effect and full meaning to the right to participation, because I think the right to participation has so far been given a very narrow view of, like, it's quite like tick boxy, right? Like, oh yeah, we've consulted with you, but that's not actually what I think. If you give participation its full meaning and you push it, it means so much more than that. And then I think once you've got that, once you're giving full effect and meaning to participation, I think the role of the state changes to a degree. Yeah.
Hey!
Not so much an Irish lucky number as an age that I really enjoyed.
One you remember fondly.
Are we being asked to reimagine human rights?
I think human rights are being reimagined quite usefully, actually. But, I think people are starting to realise we need to push the politicians out of the way when we're using human rights and start talking to communities. We have a government, for better or worse, that is taking huge programmatic approaches to things, the big monolithic giant that's going to step by step try and build enough houses in this very homogenous way. They're all going to be the same everywhere. They, plonk, 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 the long march forward. And so the innovation that communities need, they'll come up with themselves, which is exactly your conversation about Hapu in the Hawke's Bay. Where they need something quick, agile, meets a specific need, they'll innovate that themselves.
There's such a sort of a split in terms of what communities want and what people are happy just getting.
Which came first, the population growth or the housing crisis?
the reality of population growth is that the way we think about buildings and space potentially does need to change.
We just got a text in. James is asking, what? James is just asking you, Sarah, his uncle Paul's just been DIC'd again. Can you help? No? Okay. Sorry, James.
Transparent, effective, and accessible accountability is a crucial feature of human rights, including the right to a decent home. Without accountability, the right to a decent home can become an empty promise. Accountability need not be about blame and punishment. It can be about identifying what works, so it can be repeated, and what does not work, so it can be adjusted. This is sometimes called constructive accountability.
Wow.
Sarah Jameson, what the does that mean?
Well, that's kind of an explanation of the principle of accountability that underpins human rights law. And in its narrow conception, it's basically refers to the state being the ultimate duty bearer or the ultimate obligation holder, so that if your rights are not being ensured, you've got a claim against the state. But again, I think that's a very unambitious conception of accountability. Where's that extract from, by the way? I probably should know that, but where is the extract that played?
Do you know, Moira?
Yes, I have a sense of where that might come from. What I want to know is why it sounds so much less believable. Sorry, there's some bad grammar in there. When it comes through an American accent.
It does. It's interesting.
I think you're right. It is the accent. It's like I had my car navigation on a male Australian accent, and it was just like, go left. And I'm like, no, off.
Says who?
Yeah. Why would I do what you tell me to do?
Accountability is often conflated with monitoring, but monitoring, for example, the collection of information and data, is only one step towards accountability. Sarah Jameson, what the does that mean?
Sorry, I'm gonna try that one more time.
It's on loop.
Yeah.
It's interesting though. I'm much more inclined to listen to that properly than the previous one.
Well, I hate
There's
to
an
suggest
interesting
it,
psychological thing going on here.
Yeah.
that was Karen from Australia. And here's Karen again with the full clip.
Accountability is often conflated with monitoring, but monitoring, for example, the collection of information and data, is only one step towards accountability. Accountability can be understood as having three elements: monitoring, review, including independent review, in relation to human rights and other standards, and redress, or remedial action. Sarah Jameson, what the does that mean?
Sorry, I'm being distracted in the background because my wife overheard the clip playing and saying my name, and now she's laughing, and it's just descending.
We could ask her what it means.
Yeah.
And we could do a quick pop quiz on the right to housing if she's interested.
Okay, so back to monitoring, independent monitoring, accountability. Again, was only half listening to Karen, but I think what she was talking about was so basically, to know whether a state's meeting its human rights obligations, you kind of need to track how it's going, and then you need to have it. You need to have data and information to see how that's going. And then in theory, in reality, states are reviewed internationally.
You know, I often think we don't monitor well, so we don't know what the heck's going on. If you look at the latest census information, it suggests that Māori home ownership has increased.
What?
The data was not
But isn't there like a sort of ironic coincidence that the areas where you decide it's quite important to establish benchmark data you also discover that, oh, what do you know, the government doesn't collect that data. So
Yeah.
this, gosh, we're interested in pay gap inequity, and then you think, yes, but what about Māori pay gap inequity? Oh, what do you know? We don't collect that. You come up against this again and again.
No, they did that. They have got that data because the analysis has been done, and they did not publish it because they wanted to focus on gender.
Right. So that's the other piece. Yes, we did do that work, but we don't think you need to know what the results were.
It's not really important for you people.
Yeah.
I think actually another word, if we had our thesaurus, I was thinking dinosaurus, it'd be about legitimacy because, Maura, you've talked actually around community, and I think there's something that's accountability is almost like communities saying what they're doing and being accountable back to governments, say, or governments being accountable to more international bodies. But actually, what about communities? Do communities think that the things that are done or offered to them and put in place for them are actually legitimate in their eyes?
And about permission, like, do we really think our rights are somehow allowed us by governments? Or are they truly universal and unalienable, that lovely word, in which case you don't need to wait for someone to tell you have that right. You don't need any permission to act on it. If you said to people you have a right to that, the government has to, through progressive realisation, that's a good Karen question, what does that mean? Does have has to meet that right.
Many of the international human rights promises made by New Zealand governments are not only ethically compelling, they are also binding in international law. Appendix 2. The right to a decent home is one of the human rights that New Zealand has agreed, under binding international law, to implement. This human right is well established in international law. Although it is binding on New Zealand in international law, the right to a decent home is almost unknown and invisible in Aotearoa. International law is silent on the socio-economic system required for implementation of the right to a decent home. Sarah Jameson. What on earth does that mean?
Human rights law is neutral as to how you go about ensuring the realisation of human rights. So basically, you don't expect other areas of law to stay static all the time. Like, I was thinking about it, like 3 decades ago, they were interpreting marriage as something that could only be between a man and a woman, right? And you wouldn't expect judicial interpretation on that point to stay the same. We said that back then, it's always got to be the same. The organisation I work for does a lot on this, and it does a lot of work on challenging privatisation and commercialisation in education and health. And it's basically looking at whether, as a matter of human rights law, whether what human rights actually does say when you start digging a bit deeper beyond that just starting point of human rights is neutral regarding the way you go about doing it, what human rights law actually says on those things and what it could say as well, because whether we can use human rights as a tool to kind of get to push back on privatisation and commercialisation.
Is there a way to shift the government to provide housing for people within international law that would get those people out of that type of accommodation?
That's not adequate housing under human rights law. That would not meet so many of the standards.
So what can human rights law do? Are we stuck at Article 3? Is this what create precedents or actually look into what nation states are doing?
Sarah, what is the most important thing for New Zealand to do to make the right to a decent home real here?
I feel like I needed an advance warning for that question. There needs to be a really fundamental shift in how lots of countries around the world think about housing, because we're talking about New Zealand, and I feel that New Zealand, it's just reached this point of just like, whoa. How there needs to be a massive shift in the way we conceptualise housing. Don't you think that there's fundamentally an issue there with our society, where we're kind of a legitimate way and a way that you're encouraged, because for decades the tax system and the other way the society is structured has encouraged people to invest in housing. at the expense of everything else, which raises risks for the economy. And I think until we get out of that mindset, I don't actually have that much hope for change. We need to get beyond the idea of tinkering to help more white people into first home ownership, and actually look at some bigger issues here, like actually giving renters more rights, actually talking properly about community housing and public housing and state housing. I was listening to someone speak from Vienna before Christmas, and she was talking about their public housing model over there, and how it was the proportion of the population of Vienna who lives in public housing is incredible. And it's just a completely different, like, it's not seen as something like, I don't know, I feel like in New Zealand there is stigma attached to public housing and social housing. And she was saying in Vienna, it's just not, the way they've done it, it's just not like that at all.
I agree. Like, where's our design thinking? Where's our, why do New Zealanders invest in housing? It's because they're frightened that they can't live off super. So why don't we increase universal super? Why don't we just ramp up universal super so we can say, put that stupid idea to bed. You'll be able to live off whatever you get from super. Ditch all that fickin' housing and release it back into the market. We don't think outside the box.
Can you describe the relationship between capitalism and human rights?
Capitalism's f***ed us all, really, hasn't it? The global economic architecture that we've had for the past, 30 years, I mean, clearly hasn't been working from a human rights perspective. And the capitalism underlies all of that. So as a very short answer, because I'm aware I think we might be over time, that is how I describe the relationship.
Who will do great harm in the next 3 years?
If it carries on doing what it's been doing for the past 30 years, I'd say the International Monetary Fund. If they carry on doing what they've been doing for the past 30 years, which is promoting and enforcing austerity onto countries throughout the world, forcing cuts in public expenditure, cuts in taxes, and driving privatization, I think they're going to do a great deal more harm. And we saw the effects of that in the pandemic, right? Like, we saw the effects of decades of underinvestment in healthcare, in education, in social security systems, and we see rising inequality. And yeah, there've been encouraging signs of talk of a sustainable and green recovery, but then last year they were attaching those same kind of conditionalities to the loans they gave out.
Who will do great good in the world in the next 3 years?
I'm going to carry on my trajectory of cheating, and again, not pick a person. And I'm actually going to say, and this fits my background as a former tax lawyer, I'm going to say tax. And maybe this sounds a bit naive and a bit unrealistic, but I think COVID and the pandemic, at risk of sounding cliche, has been a bit of a wake-up call, and I think it's maybe led to a bit of a shift in consciousness in tax. So we've seen, like, people like you would never, and entities like you would have never imagined before, talking about a wealth tax, like the IMF, but like numerous other figures throughout the world. And then last week, or maybe it was the week before, time has kind of become a blur because I work from home. Joe Biden proposed sweeping global tax reforms that would actually enable or actually make multinationals pay their share of tax, and that's huge. So I'm maybe I'm naive, but I'm holding out hope that there might be a shift in this area, and that's, of course, tax is, of course, really, really relevant to human rights from the perspective of enabling states to have, because the whole point about maximum states must realize human rights to the maximum of their available resources, and tax directly flows into that.
Sarah, what you've done is there's that running through that we can do something, and also a sort of sense of everyone's got to step up and do their part with the tax piece was really nice. It's like it is possible to get our way out of this. We just need to change the system.
Yeah.
What did you think? If you've got another minute, Sarah, and this may or may not get included in the game show, depending on whether your answer is
Funny,
witty. What did you think of the government's recent housing package? Are you up to date with all of that?
Yes, I am. I was disappointed to not see more for renters. I was disappointed. I do think overall it was still very focused on home ownership, but that to some extent is understandable, because that is so ingrained in the Kiwi psyche. The idea of owning your own home is that's almost been seen as a right or a rite of passage for so long. So I think to some extent, I don't know if I was expecting actually a radical shift in that. I'm kind of mixed, and I kind of oscillate, because when I read it, I was kind of angry, because I was just like, so much more needs to be done, and they're just not being bold enough. But then at the same time, given how cautious this government has been, when I actually read the detail of what they're proposing in terms of not enabling landlords to claim a deduction for interest, I was just like, actually, if I think about it, I don't know if I was expecting that from this cautious government, because that is going to have, well, I'm not in New Zealand, and I don't read stuff or the Herald, but I can imagine there are lots of property investors who are going to be pretty pissed off about that. And considering they're quite a big proportion of the voter base, yeah, I don't know. So I kind of my feelings about it. Overall, I don't think enough is being done. I'm very disappointed that it is still focused on ownership and not addressing actually improving the lives of renters. But yeah. But then I don't know how much I was expecting, so there we are.
Fiona, are you aware of any coverage of landlords or property owners who are upset by the government's announcement?
I think there's been a lot of media beat up. We'll go and find someone who owns a couple of properties and get them to talk about how bad it is, or people going, this is my business. But I haven't seen a sort of a groundswell from property investors, because I think a lot of the property investors who are serious as landlords are not getting tax breaks now because their businesses are profitable. So the only way you get a tax break on your property investment is if it's making a loss.
But you can negatively gear that. So like you can run it at a loss deliberately.
Yes, but I don't think many people are doing that. I think that actually we hear a lot of criticism of ma and pa landlords. But I actually think the ma and pa landlords I run into who have 4 to 6 properties are very serious about caring for their properties and caring for their tenants.
I have a pretty simple way to judge these kinds of government housing announcements. I ask myself, did I expect that change? And if I didn't, then that probably means it is more of a change than I expected.
Well, that pretty much just paraphrases back what I said. Which kind of said not very much, which was, I think it was better than I expected, but I wasn't really sure what I was expecting. So there we are.
Sarah, I think you might have been one of the highest scoring contestants. If it turns out that you've won, you won't get anything from us. But thank you so much for participating.
I just like to say there was that time that we used the average New Zealand house price, and I think that was the highest score.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think that guy got disqualified.
Ah, well. Thanks, Sarah. Lovely to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.